Joel Embiid has gone from a fan favorite with an underdog story to a controversial player, and that may be putting it lightly. While he has been putting up career numbers for a few years now, there has never before been so much hate on Joel Embiid. The reason for this hate? Well, there are a number of reasons, but it mainly comes down to Embiid getting gifted last year's MVP and failing to perform, never developing his game much since early years in the league, and a complete lack of maturity with internal team dealings. To sum it up, Joel Embiid is turning into a sour old man who is angry because he's now a vet and hasn't lived up to the fans' expectations, the team's expectations, and most importantly, his own expectations. It wasn't always like this. When Joel Embiid came into the league, he was basically loved by everybody and quickly became the champion of the process. For starters, while he couldn't actually play his first 2 years in the league due to a stress fracture in his foot, he remained a vocal supporter of the team on Twitter by posting memes and bantering back and forth with other players. This gained him a lot of fans early on and started his quick climb to NBA Twitter king for a while. Joel Embiid was a legitimately funny guy off the court, but when he started playing and showed off his elite level skill and versatility, his number of fans exploded. Early in Joel's career, people were amazed. It was the 2016-17 season, when big men on the average weren't as versatile as now. Embiid, right away into his NBA career, was one of the pioneers of what we would now consider somewhat common in the do-it-all big man. Not only that, but for a rookie, he was extremely dominant in his limited minutes. He was backing down vets in the paint, showing no fear in the face of megastars, and throwing down some strong dunks over anyone. At the start of his career, people really thought that he would turn into a Shaq type, but with a 3-ball, and that thought was absolutely terrifying to the league. Unfortunately, Embiid never quite turned into that, and the reality is setting in for more and more NBA viewers. While he did start putting up more and more numbers in the regular season, to the point where he's leading the NBA in scoring at the moment, he has not to this day made it past the second round of the playoffs. Don't get me wrong, in the regular season, Embiid has been one of the best players for years. The problem is that year after year, Embiid just couldn't perform to his high regular season standards in the postseason, seemingly choking away most of his playoff series trying to foul bait instead of playing real basketball, or having others choke it for him, but we'll get to that. Speaking of lack of playoff success, these recent years are where people have seen some of Embiid's true colors in terms of throwing people under the bus, as well as general lack of maturity and ability to lead a team. A great example of all of this is when Embiid threw Ben Simmons under the bus after the famous Game 7 loss to the Hawks, where Ben refused to try to lay it in over a menacing Trae Young in the paint. While Embiid was right in indirectly saying that Ben cost them the game, leaders can't say things like that about one of their star teammates right after one of the most embarrassing moments of their careers. Another example of Embiid's lack of maturity can be found after they got knocked out of the playoffs last year. Embiid claimed to the media that, quote, "Me and James, we can't win alone." This is something that's pretty hilarious to hear given that the Sixers are no strangers to having fairly stacked teams in the Embiid era. It's an unfortunate truth, but Embiid is just not a leader, and these cases really prove it. There have been leaders to be tough on their teammates before. Kobe is a perfect example, but he was actually one of the greatest players of all time and knew it. Watch Embiid during playoff games in the last few years, and you can bet instead of having that Mamba mentality, he's pouting and whining at the refs when his foul baits don't work as much. It's not very inspirational when your team leader is calling you garbage, yet he himself is just flopping around all game instead of taking the game into his hands and leading by example. And that brings us to today. No longer the new funny guy in the NBA, Joel Embiid is almost 30 and has really only tasted playoff failure. The chances that Joel Embiid finally gets a chip are slowly dwindling at this point, and if he wants success in the postseason, then he's going to have to figure something out going forward.
If you were to take a look at Embiid's basic stats over his career, you might be tricked into thinking that Embiid has been working on expanding and adding to his game, as he has seen a pretty steady and consistent rise in points and rebounds over the years, except for one outlier year during the 2018-19 season, where Embiid saw a pretty substantial 5-point increase from the season before, only to drop back down to his 23-point-a-game average the following year, which is pretty odd and not the usual trajectory, especially when you consider the fact that he fell short in the playoffs the previous year in a pretty dramatic fashion. So you'd think that he'd be more motivated than ever. Not to mention the fact that this was also the year that Ben Simmons really started to catch the injury bug, playing only 57 games, down from his 79 and 81 games played his first 2 seasons. So this really should have been the time where Embiid put the team on his back. He would pick it back up, however, for the playoffs, but like the previous season, his performance just wasn't good enough for the Sixers to get the win, and Embiid found himself on the wrong end of a first-round sweep. But then going into the 2020 season, Embiid seemed to be back to his superstar status, averaging 29, 11, and 3 while bringing the 76ers back to the first seed in the East. But again, a similar theme would follow, as Embiid would look like the king of the regular season only for his team to fall short of even making a conference finals appearance, as this time they fell short to Trae Young and the Hawks in a pretty public fashion. The trend continued on the following season of Embiid making massive strides in the regular season, only to fall short in the conference semifinals. But that year, with the Ben Simmons trade still being pretty fresh, you could maybe chalk it up to Embiid and Harden still getting used to playing together, as well as the fact that Embiid had missed the first 2 games against the Heat, who they would eventually lose to. It seemed for a while that Embiid would be stuck in this loop, until last year when he finally broke through the barrier of winning MVP, and many fans were hoping that he would do the same in the playoffs. But those fans were wrong, as they fell short to the Celtics once again in the conference semis, making Embiid the first ever MVP to not make a conference finals. Which really should bring up the question, if Embiid seems to be taking these massive strides every year, while also being partnered with some of the league's best passers that fit his game perfectly, why is he not finding playoff success? Well, the short answer, Embiid's kind of a fraud. As we mentioned, he has found ways to increase his point total to look like one of the most dominant players in the league, but his playstyle doesn't actually reflect that, as Embiid is actually yet to average any more than 23 points a game in years where he averaged less than 10 free throw attempts a game. In fact, the years that he has managed to average more than 23 points a game are all years that he either led the league or had the second most in total free throw attempts. Not average, total free throw attempts. Which is pretty crazy when you remember that Embiid's missed an average of 20 games a year over those seasons, but somehow has still found a way to have one of the most free throw attempts in the entire league. Some people will tell you, however, that getting to the free throw line is a skill within itself that can be added to someone's game. And there is truth to that, but it only becomes a skill if you actually know how to use it. And Embiid flailing around like a fish out of water trying to force a call isn't it. As throughout the history of the league, you very rarely find free throw merchants who actually find success on a team level, aside from MVPs and all-star selections. And for Embiid, the proof is very visible for us to see. For example, the year that the 76ers lost to the Hawks, a lot of blame was pointed toward Ben Simmons, as he did have a pretty massive blow-up. But at the same time, it's not like Embiid had the best series either. As he did manage to average 30 points a game, he did it on only shooting 38% from the field, as most of the points that he did get came from the free throw line. And in a series where you had players like Seth Curry and Tobias Harris managing to get over 20 points a game consistently on great shooting, you really don't want your star players chucking up shots and slowing the game down, especially when Ben Simmons is completely out of it. So yes, Ben deserves the lion's share of the blame, but the way that Joel tried to take over the series didn't help involve his team by just trying to force himself to the line. A lesson that it seemed that he had learned back in the 2018-19 season, the outlier year, where he managed to boost his point average up before it plummeted back down the following year. Well, that increase comes directly from his free throw attempts, as the outlier year in 2018-19 was the first year that he found himself in the top 2 for total free throws in a season, and also the first season he averaged more than 10 attempts a game. And this at first helped both himself and his team find success, until the playoffs came, and he got away with some of it during the first couple of games, but when he came up against the Raptors, he couldn't buy a call, as he was finding out that the playoffs are much different than the regular season. So his decrease in points the following year doesn't seem so odd if you look at it through that lens, realizing that the quote-unquote progress he thought he'd made the season before didn't bring him any further in the playoffs. So you saw his free throw attempts per game go back down to 8. Along with his points per game going from 27 back down to 23 a game. But once again, this also didn't get him any further, so he regressed back to what found him personal success and became that free throw merchant once again, ramping it up as his free throw attempts continue to increase season over season. Embiid has previously talked about him studying the game when he was growing up in Cameroon, looking up videos of quote, white guys shooting three-pointers, end quote, to help him develop a proper shooting form, showing that he was willing to put in the extra work on his own to add to his game, something that he might need to do once again. And it should be mentioned, however, that he has seen a pretty large increase in his passing numbers this season. Whether that's out of growth or a necessity to fill a team's weakness is yet to be seen. But the truth about it all is that Embiid has to find other ways to expand his game, or he'll end up in the same ringless position as his former free throw merchant teammate James Harden. If you made it this far, give the video a like. While you're down there, you might as well just subscribe and let us know in the comments how you feel about Embiid, and if you think we're off track on this one. Other than that, we'll see you next week for the upload.